If you've ever had an interview for a software engineering position, then chances are you've been asked a LeetCode question. And if you've ever studied for one of those interviews, then odds are you've probably been to LeetCode.com. LeetCode is used as a general stand-in term for the types of data structures and algorithms questions that companies, especially big tech companies, love to ask you during the interview process. I've been a professional software engineer at 4 different companies, and I've interviewed at many, many more. Every single one of those interviews, especially the ones I failed, have asked me at least one LeetCode question. There are books and courses and subscriptions out there that promise to give you the skills that you need to land your first job or your nth job by teaching you the patterns that you'll see in this type of interview. And many of those programs even work. But this begs an important question. Why LeetCode? I think that for a majority of engineers, LeetCode is almost entirely useless. But I also want to try and pitch an idea why I believe that companies know this and don't really care, and why they use LeetCode to hire us anyway. All right, so quick aside before we dive into the nitty gritty of this, I need to clarify a little bit what I mean by LeetCode. Obviously, almost every single problem that you solve in programming is going to use a data structure. So I'm not saying that data structures are useless. I'm saying that there is an entire class of LeetCode problems that gets emphasized in these interviews that are essentially useless. Think about things like sliding window problems, graph problems, tree problems, binary search, these things. If I pull up the LeetCode roadmap for becoming interview ready, I think that these categories are somewhat useful, but the rest of them I more or less just resent as showing up in these interviews. Complexity is very often solved at the system design level. If you take a standard CRUD app, which is what many of us are going to end up building, those things do have performance improvements that you can get, but they're around service scalability, query optimization, and this type of thing, rather than a clever trick with a data structure or some way that you rewrite an algorithm. Here's the point where I need to simultaneously pull ethos and acknowledge that I potentially live in a bubble here. I have literally never had a LeetCode problem come up while I'm at work. I have worked at Amazon. I have friends at Amazon and Google and Uber and a lot of other smaller tech companies, and none of them have ever had a LeetCode problem come up at work. But all of us have had to answer LeetCode problems to get hired. The thing that I want you to take away is that LeetCode problems, at the very least, do not come up on the job often enough to warrant them being a part of nearly every single interview process. So let's look at something that is maybe considered to be a little bit more complex that I've seen in my own career. On my first job, we had a data pipeline that did some types of processing on every file that was downloaded onto our clients' computers. We have all of these files coming in. We have different jobs that we want to run depending on details about the file, and we need to coordinate all of those things. Some steps cannot be started until their dependent steps have already been completed. So picture that you have, job A and B that need to be complete before you can start any of the work on job C and D. Let's say that you need some of the output data from job A and B to do job C and D. This feels really similar to a LeetCode graph problem. Here's the one that came to the top of my mind when writing this script about something that feels very similar to the problem that I just described to you. There's only one problem. It's not nearly this difficult. In actuality, the problem that I described is actually just a database query. You store a bidirectional relationship of dependencies, and you query for all of the jobs that you might be able to kick off when a job finishes, and make sure that all of their dependencies are actually complete before you go ahead and start that job. Very simple. On the surface, it sounds similar, but in actuality, these questions are really asking something very, very different. A common counterargument that I hear is that LeetCode just makes you a better engineer anyway because it makes you better at problem solving. And this is really abstract as an argument, which makes it kind of difficult to argue against. I personally view the way that we approach solving problems in software engineering as we have a bunch of tools in our toolkit. And sure, some of those tools are the things that I love and enjoy, things around system design. Some of those things are things that LeetCode tests, things like being able to use heaps effectively, being able to use binary trees effectively, being able to use graphs effectively. They're all tools in the toolkit. But my problem is I don't think that you become a better mechanic just by owning more tools. Having the right tool for the job, absolutely. But the problem is that I don't see these tools getting used. I don't see those graph problems getting used in the real world. And again, I am absolutely admitting here that I live in a software generalist bubble and that your specific branch of the software engineering field, LeetCode might be an excellent test for. But for many of us, it simply is not. Those tools are collecting dust in the corner of our toolkit, and we were forced to learn them, to put time in outside of work, to be able to grind and gain this skill set that never comes up. It does not make us solve problems better at work. I am currently the best at LeetCode that I have ever been in my life. I have recently spent a long time studying, but I am no better at my day job. I am not any more or less confident in the solutions that I propose. I'm not using these tools in my toolkit that I have recently acquired to solve problems at work. And I think that for the vast majority of us, that's how it's going to go. We're going to learn these tricks and we will never apply them. So even if LeetCode made you a better engineer, which is totally possible, not one size fits all, it does not make everyone a better engineer. So, okay, why do companies use LeetCode? Why is this so common? Why is this the way that we choose to hire? Because I truly believe that as much as I'm talking all of this stuff about the fact that LeetCode does not directly translate to the job, it is probably the best way for employers to hire. The reason why people love to use LeetCode questions is that it is a great objective filter. Put yourself in the shoes of Google. Let's say you have 10,000 people applying for your job, but you only have 1,000 openings. I'm sure that is not far off from the type of ratio that companies like Google are dealing with. How do you objectively weed out 9 out of 10 candidates? You need some way to methodically scale up difficulty so that you end out with some objective sense of who will make the best engineers. Overall, I think that we can admit that someone's ability to deal with arbitrarily hard stuff is probably going to translate into a work environment. If you can grind and grind and grind LeetCode and do those mind-numbing questions over and over that feel tricky and tricky and tricky, I think that once you get the job, you could, if you're still motivated, succeed. You can arbitrarily scale up the difficulty. If you're Google, you can ask really hard versions of LeetCode questions. If you are, I don't know, some small mom and pop shop that only gets 4 applicants, you can just ask easier questions that will weed out fewer of your applicants. It is easy to scale the difficulty and it is easy to be objective about. I think the final benefit here is that LeetCode problems require very little context. Generally speaking, they just have to say that you get an input array of numbers or something along these lines, as opposed to having to explain some problem domain that a team genuinely works in. Like, oh, we're in a grocery store and we have these fixtures throughout the store that are basically the shelves and they're arranged in these weird ways and we need to schedule people to go grab stuff off the shelves, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot of extra context for an interviewee to internalize. That monologue of the context creates less time to actually assess the candidate. So I think that the problem design of LeetCode is nice in its simplicity and its elegance, but I do believe that we could do that and test a different set of skills than algorithms and data structures. So as a quick recap here, I think my main problem with LeetCode questions is that 1, they do not come up directly at work very often for software generalists. 2, because of that fact, it does not necessarily even make you a better engineer to be good at LeetCode. 3, LeetCode is incredibly beneficial to the employer because it is such an objective measure of difficulty that they can scale up to meet their needs. So I don't think LeetCode's going anywhere, and I think that it is incredibly frustrating. There are great resources out there for if you do need to conquer this hurdle, but it's just so frustrating that just being good at the actual job required of you 9 to 5 isn't enough. You have to go out of your way and learn an entirely separate skill set just to get your foot in the door. And that, to me, is somewhat unique and very, very, very annoying for the software engineering career path.